I've been a hunter for most of my life. It's, without question, the thing that brings me the most joy. I don't need to mark my calendar for the opening day of deer season. My internal clock always knows exactly how long I have to wait before I can climb into my tree stand for the first time each year. My friends and family know that on the weekends during bow hunting season, they're unlikely to see me. I stopped apologizing for this a long time ago. I think that without hunting, my life would lack balance. The time alone, outdoors, in the silence. Not enough people understand the kind of maintenance that can do on your soul. This year, late September came right on time. I'd just gone through an overly dramatic breakup, and I was desperate to spend some time on my own. The two friends I normally hunt with had been graciously reading and thumbs-upping my excited text messages on our group chat for weeks. I had gotten permission to hunt our favorite spot. The landowner had been great about us letting onto his lot for a few years now. He even mentioned seeing plenty of deer on his land throughout the summer and early fall. Counting the days to the weekend was an understatement. I was counting hours. Thursday night, they both bailed. I couldn't believe it. Dan had a sick kid, and Mike said his knee was acting up, so he didn't want to slow me down. I tried to be an adult and not broadcast my disappointment. I messaged back, saying simply, "More bucks for me then." 2 thumbs up came back. Friday evening, I double-checked all my gear and sent one last message to the group chat. Heading out to the Lawson's place tomorrow at first light. If you don't hear from me by noon Sunday, send a search party. LOL. Another pair of thumbs up emojis popped up. Satisfied, I set my phone on the counter, poured myself a drink, and checked the forecast again. Clear skies for the weekend. Cold, but clear. Perfect hunting weather. But something was nagging at me. Maybe it was the lingering sting of my friends bailing, or maybe it was the monotony of going back to the same location. I wasn't even sure, but the longer I sat there, the more restless I felt. By the time I went to bed, I'd made up my mind. I needed a change of scenery. At 4 a.m., I was wide awake and packed. But instead of heading toward Lawson's land, I found myself steering my truck down Route 275 toward the Pennsylvania border. I hadn't hunted this region in ages, but sometime between bed the night before and packing the truck, I had decided I'd be in a bad mood at our usual spot without my friends. It wasn't entirely an impulse. I missed Bolivar, and my uncle had acres of land down this way and practically begged me to use it each year. Before leaving the house, I shot him an email thanking him in advance. Knowing him, he'd read that email around the 4th of July, if ever. He was down in Florida already, so I could forgo stopping by his place to thank him in person. As the sun rose, I reached the field I remembered using years ago. I nosed my truck between 2 towering evergreens at the field's edge. The morning air smelled of damp earth and pine, and I felt a surge of excitement as I grabbed my bow and pack. No one to disturb me. Even if I didn't get anything, it was going to be a great day. The walk in and the search for signs of game took longer than I expected. The forest was dense, the underbrush thicker than I was used to, and the trail markers, what few there were, looked old and worn. Eventually, I found a clearing I remembered from the last time I'd hunted this land. One of my uncle's ladder stands was there waiting. This spot had been so good over the years, I doubt he ever took it down or moved it. Better yet, there were signs of deer activity, tree rubs and ground scrapes. It was perfect. I think I was so encouraged by the situation and obvious signs of game that I chose to ignore the worn look of the ratchet straps holding the stand and ladder to the tree. After admiring the location a bit longer, I gave the ladder a cursory shake. It held fast. I exhaled deeply as I climbed the ladder, so genuinely heartened to be here, surveying an empty section of forest. I connected the safe line to my harness and then around the trunk of the tree. These ladder stand chairs aren't big or comfortable, but they do the job. I could see everything from this vantage point. I knew the deer moved through here, and I could see matted places in the brush where the game trails broke into the clearing. Hours passed in silence. I watched as blue jays, squirrels, and geese moved through the area, but no deer. Sometime around noon, I was trying to quietly munch some trail mix when I spotted movement to my left. My heart leapt as I forced myself to turn slowly. A sudden movement, even just my head, could spook a deer. But it wasn't a deer. It was a man. He was about 50 yards away, half hidden by the trees, and he wasn't dressed like a hunter. No bright orange, no camo. His clothes were dark and nondescript, and he wasn't carrying any gear. It almost looked like he was wearing a jumpsuit. It was hard to tell with some branches and brush obscuring him. He stood completely still, staring in my direction, though I couldn't make out a face clearly. I half wondered if my uncle had put a mannequin out here as a joke. I raised a hand, a silent and universal hunter's gesture of acknowledgement, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, looking up at me. My pulse quickened. Suddenly the man moved. Not toward me, but deeper into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I stayed, frozen, listening for the sound of his retreat, but the forest swallowed him up without a trace. "What the hell?" I murmured softly. I couldn't shake the image of that man, the way he stood so still, the uncanny, out-of-place look of his clothes in the woods. It was so bizarre. My heart was still racing as I sat there staring into the trees where he had vanished. It was around then I noticed something else. Quiet. Not the peaceful kind I normally loved about hunting, but a heavy, unnatural silence. The birds and squirrels had been so active earlier and now were nowhere to be seen. Even the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to have stopped. Then, I felt the change in the air. Snowflakes began to fall. At first, they were delicate, drifting sleepily down, but within minutes they came faster, thicker, like someone had flipped a switch. The ground, already cold from the night, quickly began to frost over. Before I knew it, the snow was starting to accumulate in earnest, erasing the faint game trails and scuff marks that had guided me into the clearing. I sat, stubbornly squinting into the snow for over an hour. Finally, and with resignation, I told myself I'd pack up and head back to the truck. The snow was making it so difficult to see that I felt my chances of spotting a deer and getting off a clean shot were near zero. I was so frustrated that the day was seemingly toast. I stood and waited to feel my legs begin to wake up. After hours of holding completely still, I felt stiff and clumsy. I maneuvered gingerly on the tiny stand platform to begin my descent down the ladder. Just as I reached to unclip my safety line from the tree, I felt the platform shift. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. I watched as a discolored ratchet strap holding the stand to the tree pull apart. Somehow, I had the presence of mind in that moment to briefly think, dry rot. The stand tilted back violently, and I flailed for the tree's trunk. Grabbing only air, I careened backwards as the tree stand began to tilt away from the trunk. My safety line caught and snapped my fall to a halt. I swung wildly. Then everything went black. I opened my eyes with great effort. I think it was the splitting headache that woke me. The disorientation I felt was like nothing I'd ever experienced. The snow was still falling, and the world was upside down. By degrees, I understood that I was hanging from my safe line. The pain in my head was rivaled only by the immense pressure I felt on my thighs, where the harness strained against my weight as I dangled from the tree, still at least 10 feet off the ground. I began to assemble a plan to get down. I'd grab the ladder and climb back up until the tension was out of the line. But as I looked around, I didn't see the ladder. That is, until I looked down. The stand and ladder had come completely free from the tree and lay on the ground beside the base. I looked up. The rope had snagged on a limb and left me dangling out a good 6 feet from the trunk of the tree. I was dangling like a piñata. I'd like to say I was the type who could haul himself right up the rope with raw strength, but I am not that guy. The sun was already weakening. I wondered how long I'd been out. As I tried to make sense of the time, something far more troubling occurred to me. I'd told my friends to come looking for me if they didn't hear from me by noon on Sunday. But worse yet, they thought I was on Lawson's property, 80 miles north of here. No one knew I was here. Except... I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but it was hard with all the blood running there. I thought of all the times I'd conjured up a situation like this in my head. How bad could I screw up if I wasn't careful? Well, I'd just made about every mistake a hunter could make short of impaling myself on a broadhead arrow. I didn't report my location to anyone. I checked the weather forecast for one county and then went hunting in another. And I'd ignored worsening weather conditions instead of getting the hell out when I could have. Perhaps most alarming was the knowledge that I'd lost cell service before I even parked my truck. There was no shot of making a call. None of that mattered now. The sun was going down, the temperature was dropping, and I was going to need to get very resourceful or very lucky in the next few hours. I wasn't dressed for snow. I would be an icicle hanging from this tree by morning. I chuckled crazily at the morbid thought as I tried to deny that I was genuinely frightened. After years of diligent, safe hunting, my situation had gone completely out of my control in a matter of seconds. I stifled the panicked laughter and tried to take steady breaths. Just as I began to control my breathing and consider my options, I heard something. A single, distinct crunch. I stopped breathing, desperate to know the source of the sound. I remained silent for several miserable minutes, half hoping to hear the sound again, half fearing I would. Without warning, it came again, another crunch, this time louder, then regular. Something was walking through the snow. I strained my neck, trying to twist enough to see where the sound was coming from. My eyes darted through the white blur of snow and the lattice work of trees. Nothing. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer after all, or even a bear. The rational part of my brain clung to that thought, but another, the primal part, told me something was very wrong. Then, there he was, the man from earlier today. He emerged slowly from the tree line, then moving briskly toward the base of my tree stand. The snow clung to his dark clothes, making him look almost spectral. But there was nothing supernatural about the way he moved. Calculated, unhurried, like a predator closing in on cornered prey. The clothing wasn't a jumpsuit, after all. As he closed on my position, I recognized the dark sweatpants and shirt of the Pennsylvania State Prison System. I drove for a food service company. I delivered to the penitentiary dozens of times. I knew the inmate uniforms. "Hey," I called, my voice cracking with equal parts fear and relief. Relief because this was a person, someone who could help me. Fear because this man terrified me, and had, since I'd laid eyes on him earlier today. He didn't respond. He didn't even look up at me. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him. "Hey!" I yelled again, louder this time. "I need help." He stopped, finally looking up. His face was pale and weathered, his eyes dark and unreadable. He looked exhausted. For a moment, he just stared at me, the same way he had earlier in the day. Then, slowly, he reached down and picked something up off the ground. The ladder. He turned it over, inspecting it like some kind of curious artifact. "Hey, man, listen. I need that ladder," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm hurt. I can't get down without it." He didn't reply. Instead, he pulled the ladder away from the base of the tree and rested his foot on the lip of the fallen stand. He stood there, watching me dangle, his expression unreadable. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice rising in panic. "I'm going to freeze to death up here." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away. "Hey!" I screamed after him, but he didn't look back. His figure faded into the falling snow, and soon he was gone. I was alone again, dangling from the harness, the cold cutting through my hunting gear and into my bones. I stared at the trunk of the tree, just a few feet away. My mind raced. Could I swing myself toward it? No. The distance was too much. Even if I reached it, there weren't any conveniently placed limbs to seize and climb. I realized that I was going to have to cut the harness and drop down. The fall could probably break my legs, or worse. Racing to weigh my options, I considered the man who'd just been here, just left me here. If he were to come back, there was no way it was going to be a good thing. If he meant well, he'd have already helped me down. Something about him made me fear the worst. He was so blank, so dead behind the eyes. I didn't want to know what he was capable of. I had a pair of knives, the more accessible of the two on my belt. I reached for the one on my hip, praying the cold hadn't numbed my fingers to uselessness. My movements were slow. The strap of my harness pressed harder against my chest and ribs with every inch I reached. Finally, my hand brushed the handle. I gripped it tightly and drew the blade, the metal glinting dully in the dim light of the snowstorm. The knife felt solid in my hand, but as I tested the edge against the taut nylon strap of the harness, a new fear struck me. If I cut the strap and fell wrong, I could land on the knife, or worse, I could break my spine and be left helpless in the snow, waiting for the man, or the cold, to finish me off. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I didn't have time to second guess. The cold was getting worse, seeping through my layers, stiffening my limbs. If I didn't get down soon, I'd freeze to death before the night was even over. I was going to begin with the leg straps and work my way up. My hands trembled as I began sawing at the first thigh strap, the blade biting into the material with every stroke. I'd already considered cutting the safety line, but that wasn't an option. I had invested in cut-resistant Kevlar thread rope. Brilliant. The first strap gave way with a snap. I felt my weight shift, and with one leg free, I began to slowly turn. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to steady myself, gripping the rope with one hand while I worked on the second strap. My breaths came in short, frantic gasps, the cold air burning my throat. The sound of footsteps in the snow. He was coming back. I froze, my knife poised against another strap. my heart pounding now. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could see his shadowy figure moving between the trees. He was dragging something now. A bundle of tree limbs and branches. My stomach turned as I realized what he was doing. He was going to build a fire. I worked faster, slicing at the strap with renewed desperation. The man reached the base of the tree and began stacking the wood directly beneath me. He didn't look up, didn't say a word. He just worked methodically. His movements were calm and determined. The sight of him, so focused and unhurried, made my skin crawl. Another strap finally gave way, and I clung to the rope, dangling precariously. The sound of stacking wood below me ceased. I looked down to see him staring up with a perturbed grimace on his face. He picked up an enormous tree branch from his pile. Taking a step back, he turned and swung the branch from his waist like a massive baseball bat. I realized helplessly what he was doing and braced myself for the impact. The limb struck my arm and ribs with a sickening thump. White-hot pain shot through me. The knife fell, spinning from my hand and disappearing noiselessly into the snow. I reeled in pain as I spun wildly on the line. He returned to his work as I continued swinging in a dwindling arc over the pile of branches. As he lit the wood, I focused on remembering which calf my second knife was lashed to. The fire grew quickly, the dry wood crackling and popping as flames licked hungrily at the pile. Smoke began to rise, stinging my eyes and filling my lungs. I coughed, trying to stay quiet, but the sound drew his attention. He'd been adding to the pile furiously, but he stopped to look up, his face flashing in the flickering firelight. For the first time, I saw something specific in his expression. Not rage, not malice, just curiosity. I didn't wait to find out what he would do next. I lunged desperately upward and pulled my knife from its sheath on my leg. Grunting with panic, I slashed at the last harness strap holding me aloft. I heard the fabric pop as I made the final cut. Gravity took over, and I plummeted into the fire. The heat and smoke enveloped me as I hit the burning wood in an explosion of sparks and noise. I rolled away, frantic, smothering the embers clinging to my jacket and pants. The man stumbled back in surprise, his calm demeanor finally breaking. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my knife, and locked eyes with him. His expression looked like he had just woken up and was realizing that this was actually happening. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was breathing hard. I could smell the acrid stink of burned hair. Suddenly, he dropped the bundle of wood he'd been holding and turned, bolting into the woods. Adrenaline coursing through me, I ran the opposite direction. "Just get to the truck," I chanted in my mind as I stumbled through the brush. I practically collapsed against the driver's side door, fumbling with the keys. My hands were so numb I could barely grip them, but I finally managed to unlock the door and climb inside. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the forest ahead, the falling snow swirling in the beams. I didn't wait to see if he was following me. I threw the truck into reverse, the tires spinning on the icy ground before catching traction. As I sped down the narrow forest road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the endless white of the snowstorm and the dark looming trees. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop. I only sped up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady, but I kept driving until I reached a rest stop miles away. As I sat on the floor of the convenience store with my back to a glowing cooler of energy drinks, The obviously stoned night clerk peeked nervously at me from behind the counter. He pressed the phone to his ear as he explained to the police some version of the story I'd shared when I staggered in a few minutes ago. I heard him mention something about my burned-up jacket before he turned his back and lowered his voice. After he'd finished the call, he stepped around the counter and stood timidly beside me. Cops are on their way. I nodded, gazing numbly ahead. He spoke again, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. You said you were a hunter? Yeah, I answered. I was.